Okay, there we go. Okay, you know, I don't know what it is about the audio setup on OBS Streamlabs. Every single time, for some strange reason, when it gets an update, everything just changes back. Everything just reverts back, and I have to reset it up. I've reset up the defaults, and so apologize for that. But hopefully you got sound now, and hopefully you have the sound for the intro. I wasn't listening to it. Kano is listening to it. You said you had heard sound? Awesome. All right, so first things first, let's get a couple things out of the way. There's a lot to go over this morning as far as the topics I want to discuss. I put a vote on Twitter on what you kind of wanted to narrow down to, and it kind of came up a little bit of everything. So that presents a little bit of a problem because I didn't want to do a 2-hour stream this morning. I figured about an hour. But people wanted to talk about things like radical beliefs, justifying radical beliefs, burden of proof, and then a little bit about what we owe ourselves as far as moral duties. Now, what I usually do is this. I'll take a question, right? And I'll post a question in many different places. And I posted this on Facebook. I posted it on Twitter. And immediately somebody actually had a good answer, which I hadn't really I had to modify my question because the answer was really that good and I didn't even think about it. So the question I had asked initially was, if there's no other person around, if you're the only person alive, do you have any moral obligations? Because the way I usually think of morality is that it's how we interact with other people. It's a societal based thing. Society over time have learned what moral things work and what don't to have eudaimonia, to foster flourishing in society. And so I was thinking, just like, most people do on these topics, that why, what would it mean to have morality if there's nobody else around, right? But then somebody actually posted something about animals. And of course, yes, I think that being cruel to an animal just for the sake of being cruel, I mean, that doesn't, by the way, just being cruel itself is obviously horrific. But being cruel to an animal, you're not going to eat the animal, and you're not hunting, for food or anything like that. I'm not a sports hunter, so I don't really enjoy that at all. I fish, but I can see how people want to hunt, but whatever. Not my thing. But as far as like just being cruel to an animal for the sake of being cruel, that would be immoral. So I kind of had to change the statement to, what if you're the only living thing? Because I do consider animals agents of moral consideration, meaning that I think that as stewardships to them, we have this, relationship with animals, and I mean brute animals, right? I mean, I obviously know in biology that humans are animals, but it's the fact that we being animals is only a biological thing as far as taxonomy. What generally speaking is an animal, of course, is a multicellular chemohomotropic living being. But when we talk about animals, in this sense, I'm going to be talking about brood animals, right? So brood animal is not human. Humans taken out of that. So yeah, I think we have a more responsibility to animals. So I did have to reword that a little bit. And afterwards, some of the feedback I got on that particular question was pretty interesting about moral duties. So I do want to touch on that quite a bit, but I want to kind of bring it back to like these radical ideas and justifications for it. So a long time ago, this guy named Clifford, W.K. Clifford, and back in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, he wrote something called the Ethics of Belief, and he basically has a statement called Clifford's Principle, and it says it is wrong in all cases to believe on insufficient evidence, and I deny that principle. I think that principle is not correct as far as how we should go about thinking about morality, and I personally think that probably most people probably do. By the way, I'm taking this phone off there because this isn't actually the right phone thing. So one sec. That's it. Yeah. Because I think there are reasons, which I will go into, why I don't think it's morally wrong to believe something without insufficient evidence. Matter of fact, a properly basic belief is something believed with insufficient evidence because it's taken axiomatically, right? So I deny Clifford's Principle, and I was thinking about these duties that we have to other people and to ourselves, and given that, is it a moral failing to believe something without evidence? Because of course, every time you get into these chat rooms with these hardcore militant new atheist TM, they always basically say things like, you shouldn't believe things without evidence. I'm like, well, that kind of eliminates all kinds of things like properly basic beliefs, right? If you can't take things axiomatically, which has no evidence either way for, right? I have no evidence that the uniformity of nature will continue. I mean, I assume it, right? It is assumption, but I can't prove it. I can't justify it. I can't argue for it one way or another, other than for me taking an axiomatic assumption. So I don't have sufficient evidence to justify that. It's non-justifiable. Same thing with Hume's problem of induction, right? I use induction. I think that's how we acquire new knowledge, but we can't justify induction. Hume said basically that there's really no way to justify induction without using induction. And I agree with that. I think there's some pragmatic approaches people have been trying to do with trying to get around that. I tried reading one paper on it, but I didn't quite understand it. So, but as far as like these, excuse me, believing stuff with insufficient evidence, yeah, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I do think that we have reasons to believe things that are not based on any evidence. I take them as what's called faith-based commitments. But as far as like believing to ourselves, the moral duties that we have to ourselves, do we need proper justification for that? Like if we have a radical belief, do we need proper justification? Even in science, there's a lot of radical beliefs. Some of them pay off. I mean, some of the people that think outside the box have come up with some of the greatest theories we've ever had, but they've done so with very radical ideas. And people that maybe not understand the topic will go, yeah, this is insanity. And other people that do understand the topic will be like, this is genius. But what is their justification for these beliefs? When it also comes to, these kind of beliefs, let's say we have a false belief. Like for example, let's say there's an elderly person, and they just have the belief that their longtime cat that they've lived with carries on conversations with them to comfort them. Do we have a moral obligation to let them believe that based upon I believe that's a false statement, right? I believe that they're not talking to their cat, correct? But it is, to me, a moral failing not to allow that person to have some comfort. So in that case, it is wrong to act in all cases to believe on insufficient evidence. Well, isn't it? And by the way, we're not talking about epistemologically wrong. We're not talking about knowledge being right or wrong. We're not talking about the fact of the matter being right or wrong. We're talking about a moral failing here. Is it a moral failing to allow that person to have a false belief. Because according to Clifford's principle, it'd be wrong in all cases to believe on insufficient evidence. And I don't think so. I think that it is. I think it is more humane to allow that person to have a false belief. So in that particular case, when you have a radical belief, such as, hey, I'm able to be, communicate with my cat, it is, to me, more of a moral failing to cause harm to that person by trying to take that comfort away. Matter of fact, I don't know if you guys remember, a long time ago, there was a discussion on the Non Sequitur show about if somebody was dying, and they asked you to pray with you, would you pray with them? And of course, Godless Engineer was there, and he's like, no, I wouldn't pray with them and stuff like that. I'm like, well, I find that to be, personally, I found that to be a moral failing, because even though I don't believe prayer works or anything like that, if it gives comfort to the person, then that would be the moral thing to do, right? Because if I'm basing my morality on virtue ethics, which I tend to do, well, again, no one size fits all. I get that. You can appeal or tend to any of them, any of the moral theories, but I happen to prefer certain ones over others. Virtue ethics and value pluralism and moral universalism. Those are the ones I generally go to. So that would be mostly, I think kind of standard for us for the most part. I do believe that most moral philosophers are more realist. Now, that only goes by, the only reason I say that is because, one, most of the ones I talk to are, and there was a Pew poll that I think it was like 56% or something like that was more realist. So I think that is generally the case. And with moral realism, there only has to be one objective moral fact, just one. It doesn't have to be like all of them. And of course, all of them are not. There are obviously morals that are going to be subjective. I don't accept cultural relativism. I think there's descriptive moral relativism, but that just describes. So, these are my things that I tend to. So in Clifford's principle, is it wrong in all cases to believe on sufficient evidence? Well, no, even from a scientific standpoint, right? So if you have this radical idea in science and you go, look, I don't have sufficient evidence for this, but I'm looking for evidence for this because I think that this is a viable theory or hypothesis, right? It allows you to think outside the box. A lot of times when we think outside the box, we don't have sufficient evidence, right? So if you went by Clifford's principle, then I don't see any personal way how somebody could ever really think outside the box, because they wouldn't have sufficient evidence at the time to even start formulating these hypotheses. And why would you promote a hypothesis if you didn't believe it, right? I mean, if I was convinced of something, and like, look, I don't have sufficient evidence for this, but I'm convinced of it, and let's say you have other reasons for it, pragmatic reasons, intuition reasons, whatever the reasons are, but you're like, man, this I believe this, I feel right that it works. That this theory is, is the correct one, but I'm looking for evidence for it. I don't see a problem with that. Now, a lot of people come back and say, well, science tries to disconfirm things. Well, yeah, certain to a point. When you're doing a scientific experiment, you try to reject the null, right? But at the same token, scientists still try to find evidence to support their beliefs, right? Scientists still try to find evidence to support their claims. So if they didn't have sufficient evidence and they didn't believe it, then I think a lot of these more radical ideas, and I mean radical ideas that have at least some basis, right? Not just completely hogwash. I mean, there's obviously conspiracy theories that have absolutely no comporting with reality whatsoever. But the ones that do, I think that Clifford's principle is wrong on that. Now, that kind of goes into the duties we have to ourselves. Like I've always said, and this is really my personal belief. I've had some things I found that kind of support it and stuff like that. But I believe that we have an epistemic duty to justify our beliefs as much as we can, which is the reason to have a rational belief. To have a rational belief, it has to be justified. So that is a duty to myself, but is it a moral duty? Because the problem with having moral duties to yourself is that one of the ways it's looked at is that you have a moral duty to somebody else usually, okay, and then that person has a moral that person can relieve you of that moral duty. They have a right over you, Okay, so you have a moral duty to them. They have a right over you, and they can absolve you of that moral duty. So let's say that, I borrowed Kano's car, okay? And I didn't give it back, which would be, joyriding or something like that, or theft or whatever. And so I have a moral duty to her. Now, she could relieve me of that duty and say, no, take it for as long as you want, right? Or if I say, hey, can I borrow $5? I have a moral duty to give that back to her. Or she can just say, hey, don't worry about it. Or, let's say she buys me a drink and I say, yeah, I owe you, I owe you one back. She's like, no, it's on me, kind of thing. Okay, so there's a relationship that I think between the duty and the rights. So you have a duty to somebody else. They have a right that they own over you or have over you, but they can alleviate that right. And I'm wondering, how do we have a moral duty to ourselves if we can't really give up our own right? We can't really give up our own duty to ourselves. I don't think it seems paradoxical to me, and that seems to be what I read in the literature. That if I look, for example, if I take out $5 from my bank account, I'm not stealing from myself, right? So if I'm not stealing from myself, I can't absolve myself of that. I can't say, hey, look, you don't need to pay me back. So what would it mean to have a moral duty to yourself? But I do accept there's an epistemic duty to yourself to justify it. So I think the way for me personally, to try to reconcile those things, that there's to differentiate between the moral duty and the epistemic duty, right? So the epistemic duty is only due if you want to have rationality. If you want to be rational in your beliefs, right? If you want to be rational for what you hold to be the case, then there is an entailment. Well, at least I don't know if it would be entailment, but at least an implicature there that in order to do so, they need to be justified. I don't know what a belief would be rational without justification. And I'd love to get your input on that. If maybe there's a way to say, yeah, my belief is rational, but it's not justified. I don't think that's the case. I don't know how that would be the case. To me, to be rational means to be justified. Van Veen says, not praying with somebody who's dying and ask you is kind of cold. You could just sit with them, hold their hand, and be silent when they pray. Putting your stance on theism above comforting is silly. And I agree. With that. I think that, as a non-believer, if somebody's on their deathbed, what moral stance do I take by saying, no, I'm not going to pray with you, or I'm not going to have a silence with you, or I'm not going to, give you comfort in your hour of need? Van Veen said, then again, I've seen Christians on YouTube imprecatory death prayers to people, so there exists a level of coldness. Anyway, all the best, Steve. Have a good one. Thanks. Peace and respect. Thanks, Van Veen. It's been a while. Gotta see you around. And so, yeah, no, I happen to agree with that. I'm like, look, there are moral things that we have to the dying, and this goes into another thing that they had mentioned on my question on all these places was, what about suicide? And the thing with suicide is this: I do believe in autonomy. I do believe in right to die, and I think it's probably the ones that don't believe that generally do have very strong religious convictions. Although I don't understand those religious convictions, because I cannot imagine a deity that would want you to suffer in life for whatever reason. I don't get it, even with the problem of evil. So why would I get it to have additional suffering in your end days? You're going to die anyway. There's no quality of life at that point. What is the point of learning anything new, right? Because there's a theodicy out there that's about the problem of evil. And who was it? Was it John Hicks? I think it was Hicks, wasn't it? That, Wicks. No, Hicks, Wicks. I don't know, one of those guys. I'm terrible at philosophers' names. John Wick was that was a movie. It was John Hicks, I think, that basically said, well, we're here to learn things. And so, it's a soul building exercise, soul building theodicy. But the issue I have with that is, well, what can we learn by gratuitous evil of like stubbing my toe one more time? Then if I stub my toe 50 times in life, or 51, did I learn anything different? Is there anything of value axiologically to gain from that? No, I don't think so. So I don't really accept that soul building exercise, especially when suffering is contrary to eudaimonia. It's contrary to human flourishing. I understand pain. I understand that, it's a biological thing. I don't think it needs to be as much as it is sometimes, but I understand biologically why it can be important to a organism and a species. But as far as evil, as far as like gratuitous evil, there doesn't need to be as much as there is for people to learn something. So going back to, the moral failings, the moral duties that we have to ourselves, what would it be for me to say that I have a moral obligation to myself? Because how can I then absolve myself of that moral obligation? Can I? Can't. There's a couple different ways to look at it, and I don't know what the right answer is, to be honest with you. Right? I really don't care what the right answer, because I don't think there is one. Some argue that it's not possible to have a moral obligation to yourself, because again, the way it'd be laid out, and I can't, forgive me, but I can't. You know what? Let me see if I can find this guy's name. What was his name? Starts with an S. Singer. Mark Singer. He was a philosopher. So he argued, and this is straight out of Stanford. If A has a duty to B, then B has a right against A. If B has a right against A, he or she can give up and release A from the obligation, and then no one can release him or herself from an obligation. So if there's no entailment of a duty to oneself, if there's no obligatory thing that we have to ourselves, then there's nothing to absolve. Because again, I can't steal from myself. The only reason we have the moral things is because they impact something else. If I steal from you, you're out something, right? You have been damaged somehow. You have been hurt somehow. So what would that mean to do it to myself? Now, again, somebody had brought up stealing. I'm not stealing, I mean suicide. And I'm like, well, I don't consider that a moral failing. Especially if you're in pain, especially if your quality of life is so low, then I think that is by far not a moral failing. And then other people have brought up, you have more obligation to look after yourself. Somebody said, yeah, and people brought up well, to eat well, to not be gluttonous, things of that nature. But then again, I thought about that. I'm like, is that a moral duty though? I mean, you could say that maybe in a hypothetical syllogist, or hypothetical imperative type way. If you want to live longer, you then these are the actions you should do, right? Not smoke. By the way, I quit 6.5 years ago. Eat right. Exercise right. These are things that you ought to do if you want to live longer, right? That is a hypothetical syllogism, and it is an objective hypothetical case, right? Because it is objectively true. No matter what you believe, it's objectively the case that anybody can go discover that if you eat right, you don't smoke, you take care of yourself, you benefit yourself, you will, on the average, live longer. So I don't know how I relate that to a moral fact, though, right? It is an objective fact. It is a metaphysical fact. It might be even an ontological fact that, our existence is longer because we take care of ourselves. But I don't know how to relate that to a moral fact. And so I'm still on the fence about moral duties to ourselves, because I don't know what it means to absolve ourselves. Now we always say, like, for example, like New Year's Eve, right? We make promises to ourselves. That's always been a big thing. New Year's Eve, New Year's resolution. And then, a week later, we're like, oh, we're not going to go to the gym. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to start this. I'm going to start an exercise program. And then 3 weeks later, we don't. We give ourselves an out, right? We give ourselves an absolvement of responsibility to fulfill that big promise. Because usually a promise is to somebody else, right? It's a commissory to someone else. I say, hey, I'm going to promise to take out the trash. And then I take out the trash. So we owe it to somebody else. And then somebody says, oh, look, you know what? I've already did it for you. And I've released you of that obligation. So if I say, hey, I'm going to do something on New Year's Eve, and then I just stop doing it, I've released myself of an obligation, but did I even owe that obligation to myself? It was just words. There was no enforcement. Usually from what I've read about speech act theory, which I find very fascinating, but I'm very, very, very uneducated on speech act theory from what I would like to be. But what I do know about speech act theory, or believe I know about speech act theory, when you have one of these promises or commissives to somebody, that there's an obligation there just by the mere utterance of the words. So if I say, I promise to do this, there's an attachment of assertive force to that, right? It's the words itself that has force. That is the case, and we see this in action. There's the ability to actually change reality by words. For example, when somebody gets married and the priest says, I now pronounce you man and wife, that changes the state of affairs in the universe. You are now married, right? There has been a fundamental change. There's a propositional change. It is now true that you're married, right? There's a propositional change. We have given the priest the power, when he, under the right conditions, enunciates certain words, will change reality. Now, I'm not talking about an ontological change of reality, right? It doesn't make galaxies appear and disappear, but it makes a proposition change. It causes some change in the universe merely by speaking words. That's the power of speech act theory. So when you do promise something to somebody, there is a assertive force that is attached to that. And that other person, again, can absolve you of that. But again, what about absolution to ourselves? So Chemo says, atonement and absolution from even a vicarious liability seems to entail some sort of expiration of the sin. And I understand that well, right? I mean, the problem I have with the way a lot of Christians view damnation is that I do fall under the old trope, and this is a trope. I probably put it under that, what was it say? Finite crimes don't deserve an infinite punishment, right? Now, people can argue about the death penalty and that, and I get that, but that's a whole different argument. So let's not go to the death penalty. But as far as like sin, right, or the crime against God, because that's basically what a sin would basically be inferred of, is a crime against God. I don't know what it'd be to sin against somebody else, because they're not the ones that have these commandments. But a sin against God, to be ethically justified to have that person have any kind of long-term punishment, especially a torment, because even in our judicial system, at least in the states, right? Well, I'm not going to talk about other countries, but in our states, there are some provisions set up that we cannot have cruel and unusual punishment, right? That is something that our society has deemed to be morally proper, not to have cruel and unusual punishment. The way hell is described by certain Christians, it's not most by any means, but certain Christians, and I do believe this was back in the day, and again, history is not my thing, theology is not my thing, but just from a very cursory level of reading, I do believe that the view of hell, much more like Dante's Inferno or something like that, came from the Catholics. That came from what's called argumentum ad baculum, do this or face that. It's a called argument from the cudgel. Threats. It was to scare people, because fire and animals don't get along. Animals have an inherent fear of fire. If you go look at a forest fire, you can see that happen in real time. And so what better way to instill fear in people than say, hey, look, if you don't believe this, you're going to burn forever. But then again, when you think of the big picture, you go, how is that a moral act? I don't believe that a God exists that would do something like that. It just doesn't seem like that. You can't say there's an all-powerful, omnibenevolent being that would justify that, right? And Jack says, yeah, I can't be condemned for eternity for what I do in our short lives. That's not right, depending on the crime, of course. Yeah, and again, yeah, we're talking about eternity. We're talking about infinite. And that gets in a whole different ballgame of problems, right? Because I'm not convinced actual infinities exist. Right now, I just don't believe actual infinities exist. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I don't believe actual infinities exist. They could, but I would need some serious argumentation of why they exist. And so when you have a punishment that is eternal, that is suffering, that goes against my grounding of moral foundation of eudaimonia. Now, again, eudaimonia is human flourishing for society. I get that, right? But even still, there's a harm to be had If we going back to the stewardship of animals, shouldn't be cruel to animals merely for the sake of being cruel. And again, I parse that out very carefully. I don't think we should be cruel to animals at all, obviously. But, cruel things do happen. And so, when you're gutting a fish, you are being cruel to that fish. I accept that. But why would you want to gut a fish just merely for the sake of gutting a fish? I believe it's the correct thing to do. Eat the fish if you're going to gut it like that, right? That's why I'm not a hunter. I'm not trying to say that hunters are immoral. It's just something that I just don't get into. And I'll tell you a story. So one thing about morality, and I think it is an acquired knowledge. I think that we learn morality over time, and I think societies have learned morality over time. But I believe that there's an objective moral facts out there. And then those objective moral facts are just discovered, right? They're just discovered over time that these are the correct things to do. And I think that we do that individually too. I think we formulate our own moral framework in that regard. Now, that also, to me, gets into what's called divine command theory, that by having God tell you what is moral, you're kind of not discovering your own morality. You're not discovering what you think and should be moral framework. You're kind of relying on somebody else, right? So I think it really hobbles our ability to formulate a really coherent, strong moral framework. But be that as it may, I'll tell you a story that happened a long time ago. People know that I used to have, concealed weapons permit. I used to have rifles and shotguns, and I had a Derringer and Jennings, and yeah, I know they're not that great guns, but I did have a Browning Buckmark, really nice gun. I don't care what anybody says. The Browning Buckmark 22 was a nice gun. I have all these gun advocates. Oh, that's the. I'm like, hey, look, I liked it. Okay, whatever. Don't you judge me. But I remember I was out with a friend, and I had a shotgun, and I there's a bird, and I shot the bird, and I didn't like the feeling. I didn't like the feeling. I felt hollow inside. And it was probably like a finch or something. It wasn't like a big bird. But I really just didn't feel comfortable to do that. And so that to me helped framed my moral framework, right? Because I was like, I don't want to hunt. I don't think that we should be cruel to animals just for being cruel. And by the way, that wasn't even hunting, right? That wasn't even hunting. That was just me shooting a bird. So we learn these things over time. And by the way, I never have since. Now, I do fish. I like to fish. But again, I eat the fish. And I'm not going to get into the whole discussion with ethical veganism and stuff like that. Keno's vegan. But that's a story for another day of veganism. I do think there's some really actually decent arguments for ethical veganism. I'm not going to front. The Cosmic Skeptic is very good at some pretty interesting arguments for veganism. However, I think there's defeaters, and I think that it's not the case, because I do eat meat. But that doesn't mean we should discount those arguments. I think a lot of people just by fiat discount arguments they don't agree with without actually addressing the arguments themselves. They don't address the premises. So, but going back to the duties that we have ourselves, I do think that as of right now, even if we do have compacts to ourselves and moral failings to ourselves or moral obligations to ourselves, we can release them. So to me, it's kind of a moot issue. Oh, I'm sorry, she's a vegetarian, not a vegan. I think it's kind of a moot issue that if we either A, have the obligation and we're able to release it, as paradoxical as that may sound, or if we never initially have the moral obligation to ourselves, it really doesn't really make a difference in the long run. Either way, we're able to escape that moral obligation, right? We either A, it never attached itself, or B, we're able to absolve ourselves from it. So going back to the original thing, again, I'm only going to try to do an hour today, so I want to keep this kind of compactified. Is that a word? Compacted? Yeah, I think compactified is a word. So when we have a belief and we want to justify it, there's a lot of ways to go about doing that. I think there's a lot of ways to go about justifying. There's, obviously experimental evidence. There's obviously scientific evidence, but I think that people go too far by saying that's the only kind. There are pragmatic reasons. There are prudential reasons. There are rationalizations, to believe certain things. A rational argument is very good, right? You don't need you don't need to appeal to empiricism to justify things. You can have a rational argument based on rationalism in order to justify things. That's how I think most things are actually done. I don't think a lot of them go by logical proofs, right? I mean, I can't prove things are taken axiomatically, like the law of identity. A equals A is, to me, just not provable. It's taken axiomatically. But I can prove that 9.999 repeating equals 1, right? I can prove that. So that I accept as knowledge because I can prove it. But I cannot prove that, the universe actually exists. I just take it axiomatically. So I can justify that, believe, someone can argue I can justify believing the universe exists by pragmatic things, but I don't know if that's even the case. I don't know if it's even justifiable to believe the universe exists because you're assuming the universe exists to begin with, and that's circular. So I just don't think that's a justifiable belief. I know other people try to do it in pragmatically, but without using circularity, but I don't know how that would actually be. I don't know how you would justify reality, believing reality without initially assuming reality exists, which again is circular. I think that kind of goes back to like more of a Hume's problem of induction. So I just take reality as an unjustified assumption. I take it irrationally, it's called. So it's not irrational, but it's not rational either. So when people say, "Hey, well, you don't take," wait, you believe the universe exists, but it's not a rational belief? Yeah, I guess though. I mean, I guess that would have to be because I take it irrationally because I don't think I could justify that. Because every attempt to justify it seems to be circular because I'm assuming the thing that I'm trying to justify. I have to assume there's a reality to even start to even rationalize, right? But I think that we have an obligation to at least try to justify things as much as possible that we can justify. That's called the burden of proof to me. Burden of proof means many different things. There's not just one burden of proof. There's what's called burden of production, which is the burden, like in a court thing that says, okay, I have a certain amount of evidence that I need to bring to the court in order to initiate proceedings. That's called a burden of production. Then there's burden of persuasion, which is actually in court and extends further than that. But in court, the burden of persuasion is to convince the judge or jury that it is the case. And we also have that an obligation to other people. If I want to convince you of something, I have a burden of persuasion to give you reasons to try to persuade you. But if I'm not interested in persuading you, if I just have some autobiographical assessment, I have no onus. If I'm just stating some self-reflection, if I'm just giving you a self-assessment and say, look, I believe that aliens exist. And I mean, like intelligent life. Or I'm going to say that, just any life. I believe that life exists elsewhere in the universe. I have no onus to prove that because that's not my claim, right? If I say I can prove aliens exist, that's a whole different ball game, and then I have to differentiate between logically proving it and proving it in quote science, which is just showing sufficient evidence for, which is I don't like the word proof for that because science doesn't prove anything, but I do understand the usage, and I'm not too much against it as long as people understand the difference that technically speaking, science doesn't prove anything. But that's not my claim, right? I don't claim I can prove aliens exist, but I do claim that they do, or at least some intelligent life. I don't think we've ever been visited, but I mean, I think that usually the Drake equation and the fact that we exist is sufficient prior evidence and rational evidence to accept that there's probably more likely life out there than there is not. It's a well-justified argument because the Drake equation is based upon numbers, based upon probabilities, and I think you could use probabilities to justify beliefs. Doesn't mean it has to be the case. These are inductive. These are not deductive. But I don't claim that I can prove it. And so you're strawmanning people when you say, oh, you believe there's a God, prove it. No, you're strawmanning that person, right? And you'd be strawmanning an atheist when they say, hey, there are no gods, prove it. Well, no, you're strawmanning them. If an atheist says, hey, look, I can prove there's no gods, yeah, sure. Yeah, prove it, either logically or what's the evidence, right? Depending on how you mean the word proof. But one of the worst arguments I've ever heard for atheism is from Aaron Ra. Gods don't exist by definition. Oh, kill me. That's not an argument. that's that. It's so funny because people would always say, this particular argument, like the modal ontological argument, defines God into existence, which it does not, by the way, because I went over that last couple weeks ago with Ben Watkins from Real Atheology. It doesn't define God into existence, but whatever. But atheists will say, oh, look, this argument defines God into existence, and then turn around and Aaron says, oh, well, by definition, you're defining God out of existence. I'm like, really? You can't have it both ways. If you're not going to allow somebody to define God into existence, then how could you define God out of existence? Both of them are just, to me, categorically wrong. It's not how it works, right? That's just so mind-boggling that anybody thinks that, oh, by definition, there could be no God. That only really applies if you have a strict logical argument. By definition of what we understand by being inconsistent. For example, a definition of inconsistent in logic, it means that you can have all these different premises, but all the premises cannot be true at once in the logical system. So when it comes to the logical problem of evil, right? Yeah, that's a strong argument against that type of very specific God, because if you have a God with all the properties, the omnibenevolence, omniscient, omnipotent, and evil that exists, those things cannot exist coextensively with each other. They cannot exist contemporarily with each other, because if you have a God that's omnibenevolent, means he's all good. He would not want evil. If you have a God that's able to have the power to change these things, then he can change them. And then you have all knowing, he would know how to change them. And he would have a want to change them, right? I don't want things to suffer. And if I don't want some things to suffer, why would an omnibenevolent being with supposedly no moral failings want people to suffer? But I'm willing to give I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, right? I'm willing to at least entertain theodicies. I'm at least willing to say, okay, maybe because God's all-knowing, if he does exist, which I don't believe that he does, but let's say that he does, that if God being all-knowing, he might know things about this that I just don't. I think that's reasonable. He might have reasons to say, look, I have my reasons why I want you to suffer, but I'm not going to tell you what they are, or at least, I'm just going to make you guess, which is, again, how most Christians kind of look at morality and stuff like that. I think, and I don't know if they'll admit it or not, but it's just the guess. Unless you have a perfect pipeline to the mind of God, then these things are just your interpretation of what you read in the Bible or what you've been told by other people of what you think is morally correct. I mean, I would have to sit down and talk to somebody who has said, look, I have talked to God. This is what he has told me is morally correct. But even in that case, even if that was the case, you're still filtering it through your own biological processes. You're still filtering it through a biological filter that you have, over billions of years of evolution, hardwired to you. You just don't have direct epistemic access to the mind of God. This is why divine command theory is also known as ethical subjectivism. Now, I know there's a form, or there's been attempts to form ethical objectivism from divine command theory. I don't think that it flies very well. But there has been arguments that there are versions of divine command theory that would fall under ethical objectivism. I'm not well versed in that to even start to even tell you how that would even work. Maybe somebody else can. I know Converse Contenders out there. He's well versed in this stuff, and maybe he can. But the way I look at it, it is ethical subjectivism. Why? Because we don't have epistemic access to the mind of God. And I think a lot of people misuse that term subjective. Now, bear in mind the word subjective is used multiple different ways throughout the literature, and I understand that. It's just look, if I could tell philosophers to start from scratch, I would, right? Let's just start from scratch, get rid of objective and subjective, just like they got rid of the analytical synthetic distinction. Just start from scratch. But generally, the way I use the terms subjective is that we okay, so let me use the word objective first. Objective would be, I can discover something without having anybody else around. I can objectively go figure something out. I can objectively go read something and come to a conclusion that some other person would objectively read and come to the same conclusion, given a proper understanding of the material, right? For example, I can objectively I can objectively go look and see like 0.99 repeating equals 1. And I always fall back to that, right? So I can objectively go discover that. Why? Because I can go learn the calculus for it. I can learn the algebra for it. I can learn, geometric progression. I can understand why about series and sequences, 0.99 repeating equals 1. And if somebody else wants to go learn the math, they can objectively go look at that. So it is an objective fact that 0.99 repeating equals 1. And we can go discover that independently. I don't need anybody else around to discover that. I could literally figure that out on my own if I needed to. And that's what we can argue. Well, you're reading somebody else's work. Well, yeah, sure. But if I came up with my own premises and I look at the axioms, from those axioms, I could derive an understanding of that relationship. So it's objective. When it comes to the mind of God, I don't have access to that. I can't experience what he's experienced. I can't experience his qualia. Just like pain is subjective, and that doesn't mean subjective as in, oh, we just can't like put a quantitative amount to it. It's whatever you think it is. That's not what it means in the usage of moral discourse. It doesn't mean, yeah, it's subjective. It's whatever you think it is. And I see a lot of atheists make that mistake. That's not how it's understood. What is understood as subjective as nobody can feel my pain, right? Nobody can experience what I'm experiencing. It's isolated from them. It's epistemically off limits to them. So then when I say I'm in pain, it is subjective because there's no objective way of you to experience that. There's no way of you knowing that I'm in pain in any real qualitative type sense. You could put it on a meter and say, look, he's experiencing something, right? And we call this pain, but you can't experience it, right? So that's why it's subjective versus objective. So when it comes to the mind of God, I do believe that most people that, believe that morality comes from God is just thinking that that's the case, right? They put in their own morality and then projecting it into a being they call God. For the most part. I mean, again, if God exists, maybe there's more to it. I'm agnostic, so it's kind of hard for me to make categorical statements about that. But when I see a lot of Christians that I know have very, very big moral failings, they're not from God. I mean, take, for example, Ken Holvin. Huge moral failings, right? Just his understanding of morality has to be really, 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 really boring. Really, poor, I should say. Because I had Cindy on, and she's going to be coming on again, and she just sent me a whole bunch of stuff, and I haven't listened to it yet, but it's supposed to be pretty good. And I don't think that man has a moral bone in his body. I mean, I think he's a narcissist. I think he just cares about himself. So if he thinks that's coming from God, and I already know that he's wrong about the young earth creationism, right? I know he's wrong on that. It's not a belief. I know the earth is not 6,000 years old. Well, how do you know that? Well, I mean, I'm justified because it's justified true belief. It is a fact that the earth is not 6,000 years old. It is, and I believe that, and I believe it is justified to believe that, right? I mean, so... Converse Center says, no, pretty much I agree with your ethical assessment. I was talking about omnipotence and benevolence entailing no evil. Yeah, no, I get there's ways of working around that, right? The way the way that the modern theist looks at God from those omni properties is quite different than it was in hundreds of years ago, or even in medieval times. This is why when it came to the principle of eternal verities, Christians got together, or theists got together and say, hey, look, we have some problems in our understandings. If God is so all powerful, then can he will himself to not exist? This was a problem. This was illogical, right? Because if God is something that must be at all times and all places, because he's a metaphysical necessity and he cannot cease to exist, but he's all powerful, then how could he then will himself not to exist? So they came up with, okay, there is a couple of limitations that God has, that he can only do what is, logically possible. Somebody says an axiom is only an axiom because a person says it. Well, that's fine. Well, no big deal. Axioms are arbitrary. That's fine. A person does not make objective axioms. Never claimed that they did. But you can have an objective axiom, right? If I start off with the axiom A equals A as my premise, and then go from there to see what I can derive, that's still objectively true. I can I can start off with the premise that all I don't know, like, let me think of an objective premise. all humans are animals. Okay, and we're talking about taxonomically, right? Taxonomically, yeah. So objectively, that's the case, right? All humans are animals, right? Again, creationists could come along and say, well, that's not the case, but well, that they're not really talking about biology at that point. Or if you even want to use something less controversial, you can say that my premise is, the sun is a fusion, sun using fusion. Okay, that's objectively true. People can go study that. People can look at the evidence. That's objectively the case. It's fusion. Hydrogen into helium, helium into beryllium, and then carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, things of that nature. That's objectively a fact, right? So you could start with an axiom that is objectively true, but they are arbitrary. But once you have an arbitrary system of axioms, you can formulate an objective framework from it. Because in any given Turing-complete system, there are going to be truths out there that are not provable, right? One of Gödel's incompleteness theorem had proved that. So now Steve attacks person that's subjective. I don't know what that means. Does the axiom exist in a vacuum? I don't know what that means. Converse Contender says, Sydney thing to you is interesting, but don't know about the whole thing. Well, like I said, we're going to do a part 2. I didn't really think we got into enough stuff in the first one, and I invited Cindy back. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting. Hovind has said he wants to come back on. Haven't decided on that yet. But whatever. Tell me the lemmas and the axiom. Yeah, well, you say it's atoric, I say apodetic, tomato, tomato. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think those are the same things, though. Apoptotic, which to me is more dealing with truth, right? And assertic is that you're asserting something to be the case with asatoric force, right? And so when I say something is true, right, objectively true, like A equals A is objectively true, right? It doesn't matter what somebody thinks of it, but I'm asserting it to be the case, right? There's a attachment there of assertic force that I am telling you that this is the case. I'm asserting it to be the case. I'm making a claim that is the case. Doesn't mean I have to prove it to you. Doesn't mean I have to even demonstrate to you. Doesn't mean I have to even justify it to you. Only if I'm trying to convince you of it. I can just say, hey, look, yeah, it is my belief that A equals A. What I'm doing is I'm just telling you the status of my beliefs. I have no onus to go beyond that unless I'm trying to persuade you. Right? So even when a theist says, look, when you say to somebody, hey, do you believe God exists? And they said, yes. I believe there's a God. They're just telling you their status. They're just telling you, in most cases, the state of affairs that they have, dosastically, meaning beliefs, of what their position is. You could follow it up and ask them questions like why, this, that, and that, and that's fine. But they have no onus to tell you anything. They say, no, that's my belief. That well, you haven't convinced me then. Well, they weren't trying to. I don't believe you. Well, okay, so what? So what? You don't believe the theist? Okay, big freaking deal. What? Who cares? I mean, the entire show, the atheist experience, is predicated upon I don't believe you. Okay, we get the point. I mean, after 10 years of it, who the hell cares? Right? Who the hell cares? You don't believe the theist? Okay, great. I haven't watched the atheist experience in years because it's so damn boring. It started off at least interesting, but it's just ridiculously. It's silly at this point. It's just. What good is having people call in to say, look, I don't believe you. Well, why don't you believe me? Well, you didn't convince me. Well, so what, I mean, I look, there's a guy named John Richardson who was the program director or something, or project director or something for the Atheist Alliance International. And he's convinced that A equals A isn't true. He's convinced that, at least ontologically speaking, he believes this a lot. Okay, it's weird because he thinks it's logically correct, but he doesn't think that it actually applies to the real world. And his reasoning is faulty beyond faulty. And everybody has told him this. Everybody who knows basic logic said, dude, you're not conceptualizing this correctly. But he has convinced himself irrationally that A doesn't equal A in reality. And if you want to know this reasoning, and you can judge it, he'll be like, well, an apple, A, over time becomes a non-apple, not A. Okay, but that's over a period of time. You're adding in a variable T that doesn't exist in A equals A. A equals A has no time variable. It is an instant snapshot, so to speak, of conditions. It means a thing in and of itself. It is A is itself. A cannot fail to be itself, period, in that snapshot where it's not itself. The apple in the future now has a variable attached to it. It is no longer, if you even want to argue, the same apple at that point, because there's a different spatio-temporal component to it, right? Does time change? Well, there's two ways of looking at there's two ways of looking at time. There's what's called reductionism, and there's another what's called Platonic. Realism and Platonic reductionism, or Platonic realism and reductionism. God, I can't talk today. I'm still working on my coffee, guys. Okay, I'm still working on my coffee, and I got my chips here. I wasn't kidding. I posted this the other day. These things are the bomb, dude. Lay stacks. I've already eaten half of these. So much of my diet, but these things are amazing, right? So, those two ways of looking at things are Platonic realism and with respect to time, and reductionism with respect to time. So one of them looks at it this way. Reductionism would be that, look, the way we view time and changes of time is that there's a difference we can notice in the universe. We see if this particle is now over here, there's a temporal component. If it's staying in the same location, there's no temporal component. It's still moving through time. Don't get me wrong. I'm sorry, positional. If you see it move from here to here, positional. And we know that position is a function of time, right? If something moves, right, then it has to be over time. There's no such thing as instantaneous velocity. Now, there is like a photon. A photon, believe it or not, has instantaneous velocity to itself, but not to the observer. So if you look at it that way, if all the things in the universe just cease to change, if there is no change in the universe, all motion stopped, including Brownian motion, including molecular motion, including atomic motion, including quantum fluctuations, nothing would there be time. The Platonic realist would say, yes, there's still in that container of the universe time happening, but nothing's changing in that container of time. But the Platonic realist would think that, but the reductionist would say, well, no, at that point there is no time because nothing's moving. Oh my God, it's Jason Burns? Really? Really? Seriously, is that really Jason Burns? Holy God Almighty! Yeah, that's been a day, Jason. If you guys don't know who Jason Burns is about one of the old G's as you can get in these topics, going back to the days of Nadia's room. We're talking, I don't know, 8 years ago, probably, give or take. Had to be around 2014, maybe 2015. No, what is it? 2022. So, yeah, I'm thinking about no, had to be longer than that. No. I would say about seven years ago, because I moved about 8 years ago, so it was about a year after that. So yeah, Jason's been around a long time. Hey Jason, you want to get on the show one of these days? Email me. So if axioms are in the time, then they can't be axioms. Well, no, axioms have no temporal component. Axioms are just premises. Where's the temporal component for that? If I say my axiom is A equals A, where's the temporal component? That's not going to change. Does the law of identity change over time? No, of course not. Do you need my? Do you know how to? Okay, you know how to get a hold of me, Jason. You got my email. I have multiple emails. Use this one because this is my public email that I just use for. It's mostly spam, but whatever. Well, you can look it up. But yeah, I have my business address, and then I have two business addresses, and then I have one personal one that just is for whatever. But yeah, I'll bring you on. I don't want to do it this episode, Jason, because I only wanted to go for an hour, which means I'm probably going to stream for 90 minutes. But send me your contact information. So here, let me give it to you. Here, because this is a public email, and I don't really care about this one. Actually, give me your contact information. Give me your contact information in the live chat, and Kino will copy it down. She's my unofficial secretary now, I guess. Although she doesn't really do much secretarial stuff, but she just reads everything that comes in. Uh, I've been having so much fun. I'm gonna be nice today. I'm gonna be nice today. You know, I love you. She's ignoring me. Are you really? Did you fall asleep? Oh, I don't know how to take this, guys. She loves listening to my streams when I'm talking, but then it puts her to sleep. So I'm like, I don't know to be, I don't know whether to think to myself, hey, it's nice that she falls asleep to my voice, or that I bore her to death. I don't know. I don't know. So, yeah. Give me your info there, Jason. Do you still have a channel, Jason? Because I mean, I don't even remember much talking to Jason back in the day, if even at all. I mean, Jason was around. I remember he had a lot of books in back of him that I don't think he ever read. He says he did, but I don't know. But yeah, he's old school. It's the voice. Yes, thank you. It's the voice. No, I don't think I bore you, but if whatever, you're stuck with it. So yeah, let me get a hold of you, Jason. I'll get you on the next episode. If you read Plato and or Socrates Reformers, how do they relate to this? Well, Plato was a great thinker. Obviously Socratic method is one of the things that most people still use for these dialectics. But I think that Plato, the way he looked at things was completely different from the people of this time. I still think that Plato's cave was one of the most interesting analogies to reality, of how we view reality. That we're looking at reality from a way that we perceive it, but it may not be anywhere near what a reality actually is. Now, when you talk to like Ayn Randian objectivists, they'll disagree with that. They're one of the central tenets, from what I understand about objectivism, is that reality is exactly as we perceive it. It's almost like a form of direct realism. I don't remember what she called it, but I can't see that to be the case. Again, because we have pre-existing filters that we filter things through. Now, Mark Pellegrino, the guy that plays Lucifer on Supernatural, he just got me in touch with 3 Ayn Randian philosophers. I think 2 of them are PhDs. So maybe one of these days I can have one of them on and we can talk about Ayn Rand's viewpoints, because it's very difficult to understand her philosophical framework. I've read it numerous times and then I usually forget it about a couple weeks later. It's just, to me, I don't know how to put it. It's kind of like the gateway to philosophy, I think, for a lot of people. But if they never move beyond it, they really don't formulate very meaningful philosophical standings. I just think Ayn Rand was wrong. I think she's out to lunch on a lot of things, and I don't understand her. Maybe that's my failing. Maybe Ayn Randian objectivists, are much more brilliant than other philosophers, and they know things that I just can't. But I just don't understand where she was going with a lot of stuff. It seems a lot of it is very, very self-centered. A lot of it is narcissistic. A lot of it is putting way too much value on oneself rather than society, and especially where. Well, I was corrected on this. I thought that, for example, Mark was a hedonist, and he's not. So I do apologize for that. I found out that objectivism rejects hedonism. But the reason why they reject it, even though they seem to have the same outcome, right? They seem to be doing the same things, being able to live for themselves, and it's all about them. Greed is, greed or things of that nature. Seems to be about the same thing. The reasons for it are different. As I understand objectivism, they believe that it is rational to do that, while the hedonist doesn't care whether it's rational or not. It's just their feelings. It's based upon emotions. And the objectivist will say, no, you shouldn't base, living a certain lifestyle to benefit yourself, to gratify yourself, based upon feelings. You should live a lifestyle to benefit yourself and gratify yourself based upon your own wants, because it's the rational thing to do, right? So even though they're both doing the same actions, their reasons for it, their justifications for it are different. That's the way I understand it. Now, again, if I ever get an Ayn Randian on to come talk to me about that, then that would be very interesting. I'm a missionary in Guyana now. Oh, okay. Did not know that. Did not know that. What time is it in Ghana? Hey, Alexa, what time is it in Ghana?
Guyana. It's 7:06 p.m.
Okay. All right, so 7:06. So it's 3 my time. So yeah, so when I stream at 2, which I think I'm going to be doing this about 2 o'clock, give or take, it varies anywhere from 2 to 5. It should be 10 to 5. I had it at 10, but I slept in a little bit, so 2 o'clock. It would be 6 your time. But I need a way to get a hold of you. No, Keno just moves around a lot. That's what you're hearing. She didn't cough. But so Jason, how do I get a hold of you? Do you have an email? Well, I don't want you to put the email in the live chat. My email is on my about. Like I said, it's an open email. It's filtered and shit, so I don't care. Yeah, she's not feeling too well. I've been trying to baby her and take care of her, and feel needed. Yeah, you ain't done nothing for me. I boiled water for tea. It was a lot of work turning on the stove. You don't know. I mean, I can get carpal tunnel or something, But anyways, let's kind of like wrap this up a little bit, because again, I didn't want to touch on, the burden of proof. Oh, you know what? Let me finish up on that. I really didn't get too much into that. I started talking about different types of burden of proof, but I didn't go as far as I wanted to on it. So let me kind of finish that up. Even though there's a burden of production, burden of persuasion, there's also what I deem epistemic burdens, evidential burdens, discussory or discourse burdens, and those are all kind of different, right? So these are all kinds of different things, and I think that a lot of people don't differentiate them properly, because an evidential burden would be, hey, look, I have evidence that the theory of evolution isn't true. Now, okay, if you have evidence that the theory of evolution isn't true and you can demonstrate that and show that that theory is incorrect and come up with a better theory, then sure, that's evidential, right? That is something that you have an onus to demonstrate if you want to convince the scientific community that they're wrong, right? Now, if you don't want to convince the scientific community that they're wrong, then you have no persuasive onus to do that. You have no burden of proof at that point, persuasively, right? But if you want to convince the scientific community they're wrong, you do have a burden, and the burden is on you on the science. This is not special pleading. There is reasons for this, but I do believe that in science, because of the way science is structured, that if you think that some scientific theory is incorrect, you have the onus to show that, because the reason being is because at that time, a theory is a well-substantiated body of evidence that explains facts, that has both explanatory and predictive powers, and that has repeated predictability. Those have already been established, right? The theory has done its due diligence. People have done its due diligence, with their due diligence, to make this theory something that is confirmed, and anybody can go use this theory and see that it works. It explains and it predicts. Done. If you think it's incorrect, then you have the onus to change that, right? That's fine. I have no problem with that in science. But in philosophy, that's not the case. And so an evidential burden would be a burden that you have with evidence to show something. And there's also other types of burdens, though, other than just evidence. There's epistemic evidence, or epistemic burden. Sorry. An epistemic burden is, okay, I want to justify my belief to make it knowledge, right? I have an epistemic justification for my beliefs that make it knowledge. So I have to give myself a justification to make my belief rational. That's an epistemic burden of proof, right? I don't owe that to anybody else. I don't owe it to anybody to make my belief knowledge, right? But if I claim it as knowledge, then I have an epistemic, I'll say an epistemic duty. I don't think it's the same as a moral duty, but I have an epistemic duty to myself to justify that in order to make that claim. Now, one can come in and argue what's called the value added argument, or is there anything a value added to have knowledge over a true belief? Whole different argument. And there might, maybe not, I don't know. If you have a true belief, is there any value gained by calling it knowledge, by justifying it? If it's true and you believe it, okay. What's the added value, right, by calling it knowledge? There's some arguments to be had there, right? Now, I think that there is an added value, but not quite sure what it is yet. I'm still kind of working on that a little bit. I think at the very least it's telling somebody that you have a higher degree of conviction, right? More towards certitude than without that, right? If I say that I believe, and we do this all the time. I say this all the time in discourse, that people usually don't put out their actual position. They usually go down a notch, right? And I try to argue that maybe violates Grice's maxioms one time, and I'm still trying to suss out that argument. Some people poke some holes in my argument about Grice's maxioms, and they were good objections. And this is what I'm saying: when somebody understands these things and they give good objections, I then have to go back and try to shore up the argument. And so I am still working on my argument that if I believe that there is no God, and you take that down a notch to merely I do not believe, that you're violating Grice's maxims. You're flaunting them, which again, they're allowed to be flaunted. They're descriptive. So I'm still working on that argument, so it's not prepared yet, because people did poke some really good holes in it. I'm like, yeah, I have to think about that. But when I say I believe something, it doesn't have the strength of conviction as I know, right? If I say I know aliens exist, that's a hell of a lot bigger claim than I believe aliens exist, right? Or intelligent life. But certain things I do know, right? I mean, I know 0.99 repeating equals 1. But if I relate that dosastically and say I believe 0.999 equals 1, it doesn't convey that a strength of conviction as much, right? It's not telling the person that I have a very strong certitude toward it, because I'm certain. I mean, I believe that you can't be certain of certain things as far as in the scope of the mathematical system. We're not talking about Descartes certainty, but in the certainty of the system, I am certain that 0.99 equals 1. 0.99 repeating, I'm sorry, equals 1. That cannot be the case. That is not always true. And I am certain about that, right? So when I relate to somebody that I just believe something, it lowers the conveyance of a person's actual opinion. But we do that for discursory reasons, right? I don't go around saying that I know. In most cases, when belief will suffice, right? So I get it. I get why people say, well, I believe I'm going to do this. I believe that. Okay, fine. We don't really go around saying I know. Sometimes it really depends on what the proposition is, right? But I think we do that a lot to minimize having to justify what we claim to believe versus what we claim to know. But is anything value added by claiming knowledge? If I say that I believe A equals A versus I know A equals A, what am I adding value-wise? Other than, which I don't know if it's even considered to be valuable, but I'm just letting you know that I have a stronger sense of conviction, because you have an uncertainty area, then you have belief, then you have knowledge, then you have certainty, right? So if I move up that spectrum of conviction, I'm telling you, hey, look, I have an listen, like when it comes to opinions, I kind of narrowed it down to 3. I think I started with 4, but I think I've narrowed it down to 3 levels of opinions. You have a mere opinion, which is not based upon anything, pure speculation, pure guess, pure rumors, which I see flying around all the freaking time, and people believe that. And I'm absolutely think that you believe something on mere rumor, you're not going to be a critical thinker. You're just not. You just accuse yourself from even having a conversation at that point. There needs to be more to it to that, right? You can have reasons additional to that to believe something, but in and of itself, just having a rumor without actually anything beyond that, it's okay to maybe believe it to yourself, but to repeat it to somebody else, that's when you have eliminated yourself from the conversation. So I think there's mere opinion, and we all have those. I get those, right? No problem having a mere opinion, but you need to express it as such. If I say, look, this is just my mere opinion, that's perfectly fine. But if I start saying mere opinions as fact, that's a problem. And then there's justified opinion, which means that I have sufficient reasons to believe what I believe. Going back to kind of like Clifford's principle. Even though I don't accept Clifford's principle, I have sufficient reason to believe what I believe, right? That'd be an informed opinion. Matter of fact, I have changed the tagline for non sequitur. It is no longer opinions are sacred. It is informed opinions are sacred. And we're going to try that for a while because I think it's important to differentiate between mere opinion and informed opinions, because I do not hold flat earthers' opinions sacred. I do not hold young earth creationists' opinions sacred when they're not based upon reality, when they're not based upon facts. And that's just, again, what I personally believe. So I do think that it should be more informed opinions are sacred. But, and then the next level is that my opinion is fact, right? So if I say as my opinion that 0.99 repeating equals 1, yeah, that's true. It is opinion. Is it an informed opinion? Yes. Is it a fact? Yes. So I think there's 3 levels of it. So mere opinion, justified opinions, and then factual opinions. Now, again, I'm willing to take arguments on that. If you can differentiate between another level, because originally I think I had 4 and I don't remember what it was, but I think that if you really want to just narrow it down, then it's 3. But going back to like the burden of proof, as far as, you have again, we had burden of production, burden of persuasion, evidential. We have epistemological, right? Epistemic duties that we have to ourselves to justify belief. And then also discursory duties. If I want to have a discussion with you, then I have a burden of proof that I need to meet you in order to have that discussion with you, right? If I'm not just giving you a self-reflection, then I have an obligation. Again, but it's an obligation to myself. And that goes, all this ties in together, right? This is what I'm saying. All this ties in together because if I have an obligation to you to persuade you, you can let me out of that by not wanting to have a conversation, but I have an obligation to myself to try to persuade you if my goal is to persuade you. But then at the end, how do I have an obligation to myself on that if I can release myself from that obligation, right? But again, maybe that might hold true for other things, because I don't think it's a moral thing. I don't think that if I have an obligation to you to persuade you because I've given you something that I've said and that I want to persuade you, I don't think it's a moral obligation. So I don't think it really applies. And I think there's a difference between epistemological obligations and moral obligations. This is the way I'm kind of relating this to myself to try to have a cohesive and coherent system, is that maybe we don't have moral obligations to ourselves, because again, I just can't imagine what morality would be like without other people. You could do it if you were the only living thing. You could do what the hell you want yourself. How does it harm anybody else, right? Yeah. And at that point, if the quality of life is so low because nobody else is around, you're just lonely and there's just nothing, then yeah, you should of course have the right to end your life, right? Of course. I mean, that just makes sense to me. I don't know why would it matter to nobody's around to care, right? There's just nobody around in that particular case. So I don't know what it means to have a moral obligation to yourself. And again, that may not be the perfect way of looking at that. I'm sure there's philosophers out there that don't. I've read the philosophers that don't. There's some that do think we have moral obligations to themselves. I'm just not sure what they would be. And I'm willing to entertain argumentation on that. What would be a moral obligation to oneself? But I'm not against having moral obligations to oneself. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm just saying that I'm not quite sure what it would mean, because if we understand, at least in this context, because if we understand a moral obligation to be A has a duty to B has a right over A, then only B can release A from that moral obligation. And you cannot be both A and B in that. It's paradoxical. You can't have an obligation to yourself and also the ability to release yourself from that obligation. It just doesn't seem to me to work that way, because how do you release yourself from your own moral duty? Again, there's arguments for that you can, and I'm not saying that they're not bad arguments. It's just I'm not convinced either way. I'll say right now, I'm just not convinced that you can have a moral duty yourself, but I'm not saying that you can't. And if somebody convinced me, that's fine. Yeah, okay, great. You have moral duty to yourself. I just don't know what it would be. Suicide is not a moral duty. Prolonging one's life is not a moral duty. You want to get a tattoo, get a tattoo. It's whatever. Especially if nobody else is around and you get yourself a tattoo. What would be the moral obligation there? Flamo says, if I would destroy the microdome in the body. Well, do you have an obligation to the microdome? Are those agents of moral consideration? No. I don't consider bacteria agents of moral consideration. And again, this is a hypothetical that no other living sentient being is around. I mean, because again, yeah, obviously living things live inside you. So, nobody had brought that up that, well, if no other living thing existed, you'd be dead. Yeah, I get that. Okay. But these are hypotheticals. Okay. So give me a little leeway here. But if there's no other external animals, there's no sentient beings around, right? Let's just say there's just plants, for example. Yeah, then, what is your moral obligations to anybody? These are how at least I particularly look at why we have morality. It's to function in society. It's to get along with each other. You don't like me taking your shit, don't take mine, right? Right? I mean, these are all things, compacts that we have with other people, what we owe to each other in society. Contractualism, so to speak, which again, I don't quite understand Scalion's contractualism. I tried reading that book. What is it? What do we owe to each other? It's not an easy read. I couldn't get through it at all. I couldn't even get through the first chapter. It was just maybe somebody can explain contractualism to me in another episode. So, all right. Anyways, guys. So, what do you guys think about the burden of proof here? I mean, do you guys accept that burden of proof in epistemology is not have anything to do with the proving anything, right? You only have to prove something if you think that you can prove something, and you tell somebody I can prove something, then you have an onus to do so. But that's only if you want to persuade them. If you don't want to persuade them, you have no responsibility to do that. People are like, well, you say you can prove this, but you haven't. If you can prove God exists, I'll look at it. I'll look at the proof. I don't think you can. I don't think, well, at least logically speaking, I don't think you can prove God exists. I think there's a logical, valid, and sound proofs out there. Well, let's just say this. I think there's logically and valid, sound syllogisms and I don't want to call them proofs because they're not proofs. There's arguments that one of them has to be logically sound. If I have two arguments, and one is for argument that God exists and one is God does not exist, but they use the exact same reasoning, but one is the opposite of the other, one of them has to be logically valid and sound if they have rules of inference and the premises are true. One of them has to be, but that is contingent upon God existing or not, and that's the unknown, right? But for example, like I had posted in these Facebook groups, Plantinga's what he wrote about if he wrote either it is the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14 or God exists. It is not the case that 7 plus either 7 plus 5 equals 14 or God exists. It is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, therefore God exists, which is just a disjunctive syllogism. P or Q, not P, therefore Q. Perfectly valid, right? And then I've had 3 or 4 people argue on Facebook, well, there's no relationship between 7 plus 5 equals 14 and God. Well, there doesn't need to be. Sentential logic is not relational logic. Classical logic doesn't give a flying crap about relationships. All it cares about is truth values, right? So the truth value for implicit or on that case is if either the disjuncts are true or both of them are true, then the entire disjunct PVQ is true. So yeah, it doesn't matter the relationship. So if you have that argument that 7 plus 5 equals 14 or God exists, it is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, therefore God exists. That is valid. But then you have the argument 7 plus 5, it is the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, or God does not exist. It is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, therefore God does not exist. Both those are valid. One of them has to be sound, though. P is false in both cases, right? P is false in both cases, so you have a disjunctive syllogism that in one case, Q is false, in which case the entire disjunct is false. PVQ, both of the disjuncts are false. It's false. But one of them, it has to be true, and that's based upon if God exists or not, right? So soundness is based upon the truth of the premises. If God exists, then the argument, it is either the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14 or God exists. It is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, therefore God exists. If God does in fact exist, that is logically valid and sound, but we just don't know it. So I don't accept it as sound, right? I can't accept it as sound. Why? Because it's just, there's either one of them is possible. Now we can argue which one's more likely, but as an agnostic, I can't accept either of them as sound. Now the theist would have to accept that as sound. I would argue, rationally speaking, and even Plantinga says that he would argue that as sound, but he doesn't. He would not argue it to somebody else. He'd argue it to himself, right? He wouldn't ever call that a proof. He would never say, "Look, either 7 plus 5 equals 15 or God exists." It is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, therefore God exists. He wouldn't. And I'm not a big Plantinga fan, so don't think that I am. He's brilliant, but I think he's kind of way out to lunch when it comes to theodicies and stuff like that. But when because he talks about Adam and Eve as a theodicy, but he would argue that's valid, which it is, and he would argue it's sound because one of the disjuncts is false, P, but the other one he would argue is true. He believes it's true, right? And so who's a theist out there? Contender, I don't know if he's still there, but James, you're a theist, right? So let me ask you, if I gave you the argument either 7 plus 5 equals 14 or God exists, it is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, therefore God exists. I'm pretty sure that you'll agree that is logically valid, because that's just a logical disjunct. It's a disjunctive syllogism. But as a theist, would you not have to say that that is sound? Right? Because you hold P to be false. You believe that it is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, but you hold the case that God exists. So would you accept that as a valid and sound argument? Right? And I'll even type it out because, sometimes it's easier to see. So I'll be like, it is the case. It is either the case. Here, I'll actually do it as a poll real quick. It is either the case that 7 hang on. I type too fast and I keep making mistakes, so let me type slower. Okay, so I want to ask you guys this question here. Would a theist... man, it's too long. I want to get 100. Okay, so I can... Yeah. I can only get 100 things. So I want to preface this. Is that to a theist, would they say that's sound? Not to you. If you're an atheist, you're not going to think this is sound, clearly. But if you're a theist, would you say on the poll that is sound? I think obviously it's valid. Anybody wants to argue it's not valid, I would like to talk to you. But either the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14 or God exists. It is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 15, therefore God exists. That is a deductive syllogism. As a theist, what would you vote on that and why? So somebody voted no, but I don't know if they're a theist or not. So it doesn't tell me who votes what. You're not sure why it's valid? It's valid because it's this. P or not P, or P or not Q, not P, therefore Q. That's a disjunctive syllogism, right? You're removing one of the disjuncts. So in an inclusive or it's either one of the disjuncts has to be true or both have to be true for Q to be true, right? If P and Q are false, then P or Q is false in the implicit, inclusive disjunction or inclusive or. So that's completely valid. It's called a disjunctive syllogism, right? So how is that not valid? So I think everybody would recognize it's valid, but would you call that sound, Jamie? How does it? Okay, so you don't see it. It seems sound. Well, what makes something sound is that the argument is valid and the premises are true. We all agree that it's valid. The theist wouldn't the theist agree that the premises are true? Yeah, because the first one is true because the premise, here's the premises. Premise number 1, P or Q. Premise 2, not P. Oh, shit. I'm sorry. God damn it. Ah. Premise 2 is not. Okay, so those are your two premises. Okay, premise 2, obviously, I think most people would agree. I mean, does anybody want to argue that 7 plus 5 equals 15? No, no. Okay, so premise 2, we all, is a non-factor. That's clearly people understand that that's the case. So premise 2 is true. So premise 1 is true because one of the disjuncts is true. And no, it's not a false dichotomy. No, absolutely not. A false dichotomy is when you say there are only two possible states, right? Belief and non-belief are dichotomy, right? But belief's true. If I would say, hey, look, a person can only believe something true or they can believe something's false, that's a false dichotomy, right? But if I put them in a disjunction, that's not a false dichotomy. I can say dog or cat, not dog, therefore cat. That's not a false dichotomy because I'm not saying those are the only two ontological options. It doesn't matter whether they're unrelated or not. Classical logic is non-relational, right? All classical logic cares about, or sentential logic, is truth values. It's Boolean based. It doesn't give a rat's ass about the relationship. It's non-relational. There are relational logics out there, but classical logic doesn't care about that. All it cares about is the premises, the truth values of the premises. Premise 2, we all agree, is true. Premise 1 is true to a theist, right? Because they believe God exists, so they believe that Q is true. They hold P is false, Q is true. So what is the truth table for an inclusive or? Here, I'll pull it up here. I got the screen there and I haven't even used it. Let me open here. Oh, you know what? I think I've already got the truth table. I think I've already got a snapshot of it. So let me see. We need to add an image. Just to show you guys this, because I know you all like visuals. Let me just find this truth table. Yeah, there we go. All right, so let me just show you guys real quick. There we go. All right, so that's you can go to a truth table generator. So P or Q, right? Look at the truth table. The first one is both of the disjuncts are false. Therefore, P or Q is false. Next one, P is false, which we all agree, P is false. The next one's true to a theist, right? A theist believes there's a God. The disjunct, so therefore P or Q is true. And the next one, T or F, that's not the case because nobody thinks that P is true, but it would be true if that was the case, or both true, in which case P or Q is true. So the only case for an inclusive or where it's not true is the case that both the disjunctions are false. The theist would believe that the first disjunct is false, obviously, everybody does, but they would have to say that Q is true. They have to say that atomic proposition is true because they believe God exists. That's why, to me, a theist would have to say that it's sound. Plantinga argues the same thing. He would argue that it's sound, but it's not a proof because he would never expect anybody to accept it as a proof unless they already accept the assumption that God exists. So you're not proving anything. What are you proving in that particular case? You're already assumed God exists, and then you're concluding God exists. It's not a proof because the atheist can do the exact same thing and argue the same thing and say, look, I think that my argument's sound because it is the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, or God does not exist. It is not the case that 7 plus 5 equals 14, therefore God does not exist. They can argue the same thing. So it doesn't get you anywhere. Neither one of them is a proof, but one of them has to be sound. So 73% so far say no. Okay. But again, explain to me, I'll end the poll, but explain to me how a theist would not find that sound. Right? Because if the theist believes P is false and they believe Q is true, then the truth table for that is false true, which means that P v Q is true, which means premise 1 is true, which is what sound means. It's valid and the premises are true. I don't know what you're talking about different categories. So I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Yeah, we're not talking about categories here. so Jamie, as a theist, would you accept that the argument that I put out there, that it is valid and sound? Now, I don't, right? Like I said, I just can't accept that as sound because I don't accept God exists, right? So I don't accept either. I mean, I accept P as false, but I don't accept Q as true. I don't accept it as false, but the problem is that there's an uncertainty there of Q's status. You know, I'm not going to assert it as false because I'm not an atheist, but because the atheists can do the exact same thing, they kind of negate each other, right? The argument can be reversed, and instead of saying God exists as Q as the disjunct, you can say that God doesn't exist as the disjunct, right? So Dr. Rose says God is the one who is. Yeah, well, that's a book that he wrote. I think I have it. I'm not mistaken. I don't know. I got a lot of books from RTB. But anyways, this went over 90 minutes, so I'm going to kind of wrap this up, guys. Jason, get a hold of me. Jason Burns, if you're still out there, you know how to email me. Yeah, I'd like to get you on. I don't think I have your contact information, so you know how to get a hold of me. But yeah, there's something to do with categories here. There's something to do with relations. This is just straight truth values. But anyway, so what we went over burden of proof. We went over, do we have to justify things to ourselves? Do we have to have, do we have more obligations to ourselves and things of that nature? Let me know, what you think about the comment section, and I will try to get back to you on that. Any kind of thing you want to talk about on this particular show, which again, I'm going to be doing probably once a week, maybe more, I don't know, but at least once a week. I want to just concentrate on this channel, more philosophy and science and things of that nature. I'll have some other fun stuff as well, but I really like doing the philosophy stuff, and I want to have people come in and talk to them about these topics. I just got a hold of a couple big philosopher names the other day, and hopefully they can kind of get it in. So I'll come in and talk. So let me know what, if you guys got some specific things that within my wheelhouse. Don't get all crazy and stuff like that. I mean, look, I just have a tertiary understanding of a lot of this stuff. So with that, guys, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next time. Good night.